Well, hey, everybody. Welcome back to the Everyone Wins podcast. I'm really excited about you guys being with us and our continued conversation of what it means for us to be just as leaders. And today's conversation is extremely important as we talk about what it looks like to engage our money. How do we think about our money? And what does our perspective of money need to be in relation to what it looks like to be just? And so much of injustice often has to do with money and economics. So it's extremely important for us to have perspective around our view of money, how we steward the money that we have, and what does it look like for us to be just. So I have two awesome guests today, great friends of mine who have agreed to join with me on this conversation. None of us feel like we're experts in this, and that's entirely appropriate for us to come at this conversation as people who are learning ourselves as we engage with this topic. But Craig and Hunt are leaders and men who have really impacted me in this conversation around money, but also just in general around leadership and the ways that they have used their influence and their positions and their companies to have tremendous impact. So Craig Stevenson, who is the CEO of Carry Oil Company, is with us today, as well as Hunt Davis, who is the founder of Canopy Lawn Care. And I'm just grateful for these guys. They're also a part of one of the Just Leadership groups that we have going on. And Hunt and Craig, thanks for being here today.
David, it's great to be with you.
Indeed. Thanks for having us.
So we're going to make this really fun. It's just going to be a conversation, the three of us, as we talk about how we steward our money. And before we do this, instead of going through just history about you guys and your companies and things like that, because I do want to give attention to our topic, I'd love to know just what is it that motivates you all in your leadership and as you think about your companies, and even if you want to give some perspective on what your companies are about and how you came to be in the positions that you are, that would be great to hear too. But I want to give our listeners a sense of what really makes you guys tick as leaders. So Craig, you want to jump in on that?
Sure. Well, thanks, David. Yeah, that's a great open question. Sort of how we think about our work. For me, I think it has changed over time. You know, back in the early part of my career, it was really about just trying to do a good job, sort of prove yourself to colleagues and co-workers and bosses and that sort of thing, which was a little easier for me because I came up in a family business. And so while there's some of that, I didn't have to worry about getting fired if I just sort of showed up pretty much on time every day. But as I've, grown in my career, and the way I think about that, I think has changed. And now sort of late in my career, you really do begin thinking about the impact that you have on really most prominently fellow employees, those who come to work every day, who punch in, want to do a good job, and continue to serve the company. So I think about how to impact those folks well, and then customers and vendors, all the way through. I have begun to think a lot more about the whole sort of notion of stakeholder capitalism, I think it's called, where you really are mindful of all the different folks that you impact in your work. And so that, I think, informs the way we think, or the way I think about the stewardship of the work that I do.
Yeah. That term stakeholder capitalism came up in our group last time versus shareholder capitalism. And that's really helped us shape the way we think about impact and why we do what we do. Yeah. How about you, Hunt?
hmm Yeah, it's a great question. I'm glad Craig went first. For me, a core theme of my life is that of stewardship, which I'm sure is going to be a word that we say a lot here. But that's really how I think about my work as well. The desire of my heart really is to just do nothing, just sit on a beach somewhere or go mountain biking all the time. Like that's how I'd rather spend my time, hang out with my family. But for me, I really do feel this burden of stewardship as it relates to my work, in that God, like I really feel overwhelmed by what God has given me in the places that He's put me, the experiences that He's given me, and then He's given us all gifts, right? So the gifts that He's given me, I feel this burden to apply those in an optimal way. And that can be dangerous sometimes. Um, that it can often lead to imbalance in my life, but that's really the foundational element for me. It's much more individualistic in that it's the burden of stewardship over what God has given me and what I feel like God has invested a lot in me.
Mm.
And I feel this burden to maximize the utilization of that investment. And then, what that looks like is obviously, a much more nuanced response. But, your prompt about motivation, like I would say really that is my motivation. And it can be perverted, and it can go astray.
Yeah.
But that's the core driver behind it. So
Yeah. It's a challenge, and to really understand what does it mean to steward what we have, and to do it with freedom, because I think a lot of us feel that it's a burden in many ways, that we want to do it right. And so to be free in that is really challenging. So as we think about money, because this is really at the crux, a lot of it of what we're stewarding. Of course, we can steward our time and our talent and things like that. But for today's purpose, we want to really focus on money. How would you guys describe the way you feel about money? And I would imagine that's changed over time in your lives, and you probably had some ideas based on your own family experience and what you learned either overtly or covertly about money growing up. And then as business owners, business leaders that are pursuing profit and needing to have your businesses grow and things like that, and thinking about top line revenue and all that kind of thing, there's just a lot that goes on as we think about money. So, Hunt, I'm going to give you the chance to respond to that question first. How would you describe the way you feel about money?
I thought I was going to have the benefit of hearing Craig's answer every time. As I've thought about this question, I mean, you nailed it. My relationship with money has changed over time. Not always for the better. It's ebbed and flowed, and I would say I generally have a cautiousness about money. I have gone through periods of extreme greed, and then I have gone through cleansing periods where, like, I literally sold things and rode the city bus and just washed myself clean of money. And it's been a journey. But
Can I ask real quick, Hunt,
Yeah.
what caused you to have those flips? Were there some things that just made you go down one road versus the other?
Oh man, that would probably be a different podcast episode, diving into my entire life story. What would be the short synopsis of that? Um, life trauma would probably be, one catalyst, and then God's grace and divine intervention in my life being the other.
Yeah.
Is that pithy enough, or
Sure.
is that too pithy?
No, that's great.
Okay.
It leaves us longing for more, which is good.
Yeah. Well, I think about money as, it's a thing. It's not inherently good or evil, right? It's how we relate to it that shapes that. And it is a source of power. It can be a source of oppression, both of ourselves or of others, and a blessing. It can be for harm. It can be for healing. And, it's how we approach that really defines how it's used. And the verse in First Timothy, where, I think it's got to be one of the most misquoted verses in the Bible. It's the love of money that can be the root of, or that is the root of all kinds of evil. Money itself is not evil. Money itself is not good, but how we use it is what defines that. And for me, again, we should start a counter of how many times I say this word, but stewardship is just like the most critical element of that, and maintaining the right mindset and the right relationship with money. It's almost kind of like, the Force in Star Wars, right? There's a dark side of the Force, but there's a good side. But it takes a lot of training to have, a proper relationship with it.
Right.
You have to make Star Wars references on podcasts, right?
And on some podcasts.
Okay.
I guess this one will be one of those too. How about you, Craig?
So, the way I feel about money. Well, it's been well said that money is among other things, three things. It's a tool, of course. It's a test for those that have it, and maybe for those who don't. And it can be a testimony. It will be a testimony one way or the other, sort of how we, use it, how we steward it, to use Hunt's word, which is certainly appropriate. So I think like Hunt, my relationship with it has changed over time. I don't think you never want to get all that comfortable with it. You always want to have sort of a fear of it, I think. But as I think about how to steward it, how will it be? How will it be a testimony in my life, in my family's life, in the way we have used our resources and used them for good? Hopefully, there's been plenty of things that we haven't used for good. But like any gift, whether it's a gift of communication, the gift of athletic ability, the gift of talent in any other way, it's subject to abuse, and it has to be, you just have to be careful with it. You can't let it have its way. Hunt talked about the Force, and that applies. What biblically, there's a term that Jesus used, I think referring at least or partially to money, but maybe solely to money, and that's the term mammon, which is, I think in so doing, he ascribes to money or to mammon a kind of power. And I think we have all, in some way or another, experienced that kind of power that money can have over us and on us. It's just, it's really good to just be aware of that. I think I have benefited as I've seen others be really, really careful about the way they sort of understand and steward that power so that it does not overwhelm them.
Yeah. Craig, before you have said it's easy to make money, it's much more difficult to have money. And when we were in a group setting and you said that to the group, people responded by they had this moment like, are you serious? If that's a problem, I'd like to experience that problem at some point. What did you mean by that?
Well, it's sort of, it gets to the question of can money possibly be a burden? And granted, it might be a burden for just a few, but it certainly can be. Because you want to do well with it. It's a gift. It's something to be stewarded. It is not something to be to just be buried in the ground or to be continually invested. There's nothing wrong with continuing to invest, money in ventures. That's a good thing. That's a whole other conversation about the good and the ill of capitalism. But I think I think anybody that's reflective on any sort of financial success that they've had does wonder what next. What am I to do with this resource? How am I to make others' lives easier, better? How am I to do that? Or because in my experience, it's just not all that satisfying to continue to acquire things, whether it's, cars, boats, houses, jewelry, whatever it happens to be. I mean, in the end, that's not a particularly satisfying set of acquisitions.
Yeah. So how would you guys say it's been a blessing to you? Money has been a blessing.
I mean, at a basic level, money does facilitate life, right? Education, housing, food, fun, helping others. Those are that's the low-hanging fruit answer to your question.
Mm-hmm. How about a burden? How has it been a burden?
To some degree, I feel like any amount of money that is over and above what meets those basic needs is a burden. And it's a burden to determine where is that line, that establishes those basic needs, right? What is that minimum standard of living that is acceptable? And I feel like, determining that line is difficult. And then wherever you set that line for yourself, every dollar over and above that is a burden.
What makes you say that's a burden?
Well, at the end of the day, none of it's ours, right? Like we are called to be stewards of God's resources, and the decisions that we make, to me, I mean, it's the parable of the talents, right? It's the stewardship of those resources. What, do I grow them further? Do I, invest in, this or that? Why am I doing that? Is it just for financial return? Is it for other reasons? How much do I just give away, in cash donations? What impact does that have? Is that helping? Is that hurting? I look at it as we are all, our primary occupation is that of money managers. and we're making resource allocation decisions with God's money, and essentially, the fees from his account that we're taking for ourselves. It's kind of the inverse of how we normally think of tithing, right? Like how, okay, I made this money. How much of it can I, give to the poor people? But it's really, well, if you believe it's all God's money, then it's really the inverse of that. Like, how much of that are you siphoning off for your own account? And when you view it that way, then that there is a great burden with, okay, how am I allocating these dollars? And it's fine for those to all be on a balance sheet that you control. Like, I don't believe there's anything wrong with that at all. But your management of that balance sheet, is, to me, your job. And it's all going to be accounted for. So how are you allocating it? That weighs heavy on me. I don't, maybe I'm alone in that, but to me, that's a heavy thought. Like,
yeah, that's tough. I want to come back to that. I want to.
Are you going to free me of that?
No. I think no, not at all. In fact,
spend that money.
I think we want to ask that question. What is the line?
Yeah,
and I think we've asked that in our groups. What's the line where if you cross it, you're not just.
Yeah.
And is there a line? But I want to come back to that in just a minute. Craig, how's it a burden for you?
Yeah, I'll get to that in a minute. But I think as Hunt answered that question, I was sort of struck by the notion that there's just something good about wrestling with it. If you're not wrestling with the question at all, I don't think you're thinking about it as you ought. I think there ought to be some sort of, low grade wrestling, sometimes more than low grade. Sometimes it's a furious wrestling with it.
Yeah.
But that is the Spirit's work, I think, within the life of the believer, for whom, he or she has more than they need for their daily needs. But onto the question of burden. Honestly, I'd be dishonest if I didn't say one burden is the fear of losing it, which is quite telling. How that motivates you, how it motivates your view of risk and reward, and what is it that I'm trusting in ultimately. So that's one thing. The other, of course, is how it impacts my family, my children particularly. To inherit, resources that are not things that you particularly earn. They just happen to be family resources, and they might be substantial. Can absolutely be a destabilizing influence in their lives. Particularly if they come into it having never or not yet understood who they are in the world, what they contribute to the world, what their gifts are, and what it is that makes them who they are. So there's a burden that comes there as well, and it requires a lot of, planning and conversation, and that sort of thing. So, and then there's a burden, even if you're inclined philanthropically, there's a burden to who. There is just an endless supply of good works and good organizations and good people out there doing that work. How do you decide well how best to apply that to partner with them in the work that they do? That's a challenge. I think it's a challenge for anybody that has excess resources to sort of do that well, thoughtfully, prayerfully, and in a way that is, truly kingdom building.
Mm-hmm. So as leaders, and as you guys have wrestled with this, and that's a good word, Craig, just the step one is to make sure we're even thinking about this in a way that, the more we even talk right now, we're unpacking an onion, and there are more layers to it as you go. I'm curious to know what decisions you guys have made as leaders in your companies or even in your families that have really motivated you around using your money in ways that are just. How have you thought about the way you want to steward those resources in just manners? And are there any specific examples that you have that you can point to?
I'll start. I think it begins, particularly if you're a business manager or you're a business owner. It begins with your employees. It begins with, a journey in justice as an employer begins with the people who work with you and for you. So how do you think about compensation? How do you think about sharing the good work and the economic benefits of the risk that we're all taking together, the capital risk that we're all taking? How do you wrestle with? How do I wrestle with? The returns on labor versus the returns on capital. That is shifting now significantly with the present employment situation, where we're beginning to see returns on labor make considerable gains as they haven't in decades past. So I think that's beginning to shift. But I think as a business owner, you begin thinking about that justice question with, first, let's start with our own family. Let's start with our own company. How do I think about that? Mm-hmm. And then it extends out in another circle to your customers. How am I going to treat them justly? How am I going to be transparent with them? Look, and nobody does this perfectly, and we certainly don't do it perfectly. But I think the inclination is, as owners and as managers and as leadership team, you want to think about that regularly in your business, in the conduct of your business. And those things have their own rewards. They might not be economic rewards, but you certainly sleep a lot better at night. Mm-hmm. So that's one of the ways, or a couple of ways, I guess, that I think about that question.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think that's very well said as it relates to our companies. So maybe I'll take the family side of it. That's been a really big topic for me that I have thought a lot about. I can't say that I've got any great answers, but to me, financial education is the critical element of bridging this gap of whether you are a victim or a beneficiary of capitalism. And I've started with my boys and, making sure they are educated about money and investing and giving. And that's a large topic. I'll try to give the pithy part, and if you want to dig deeper, we can. But in terms of justice, there is this element of using our family's resources that God has entrusted us with for good. And so one thing I've started doing is with my wife, we sit down and have a quarterly, basically, board meeting. And I do a slide presentation, and we've got our family vision, and we've got budget updates, we've got financial goals. And to this last one, I added a giving section. So, where's our money going that we're giving? And it's actually two sections, time and money. And I did the money part of it all in percentages, no dollars. And we actually brought our boys in, who are 10 and 7. We brought them into that part of our meeting, and we walked through, and, I had a slide for each organization that we give to and what they're about and why we give to them, and what percentage of our cash giving do we give to those organizations. And they both had developed these really big hearts for people who are living in homelessness and people who are impoverished. And so I really highlighted, the organizations that we give to that address those. And so it was really fun, and they got really into it. And then I gave them a quiz, and I'd call out an organization name, and they would have to tell me what they do, and it was really fun. So that's kind of a little bit of a cheat on your question, because I'm just talking about giving money away. But to me, that is part of being just with, the management of the capital that we steward. And so that was really fun for me to bring them into that. And, with the idea that over time, they'll actually have influence on that. And at some point, those percentages will change to dollar signs. And, they need to be a part of that. This is the money that God has entrusted our family with, and we're going to steward it together.
Mm-hmm. I love that. I love the perspective that both of your answers give. Just one with Craig, so much about being just is doing what's already right there with us that we already have access to. So to invest in our employees, and that it starts there, to make sure they're being paid well, treated well, then move to our customers, et cetera. And then Hunt, the intentionality with our kids, and thinking about, most of us are just very reactive when it comes to our money. We might budget a bit, but we don't think about it in terms of how it's fueling everything that we're about, what our mission is, and where we want to invest, and where our gifts are. And then to expose that to our kids, knowing that, whoever knows how to manage money and understand how it works really has an advantage. And we find that particularly in communities of need, where it's really difficult to engage in business in the economy if you don't know how money works. If you don't know the tool of the trade, then you're at a real disadvantage. So you've talked a lot about how financial education is so critical as a justice issue, to ensure that people who haven't had that exposure get the opportunity to develop those skills so that they can really compete in the marketplace and win, right?
Yeah, that's right. I mean, I believe that in the U.S. we've created the greatest wealth creation machine ever known to man. And the problem is we don't hand out an owner's manual or require training prior to usage of that machine. And, as with all big complex machines, they can be really dangerous if you start operating them with no knowledge of how to operate them. And, and that's what we do. We have kids graduate high school, they know the periodic table, but they don't know about money, and we throw them into it. And it's real easy to be the victim of that.
Well, I want to go back to that line question. And is there a line that if you cross it, you're not being just? God gives us, or is there even a line? God gives us an interesting principle of economic justice when he commands his people in the Old Testament to think about gleaning, which is this idea of not going over your fields too many times, but leaving some on the edges so that those who are poor, or those who are the foreigners, can come and glean the fields themselves, so that they have the opportunity to have dignity, to take care of themselves, just instead of relying on charity. So it's this idea that we should actually leave some edges, and some people would even translate that as profits, so that we can give opportunities for others who wouldn't normally have opportunities to access those resources, instead of making all the money that we can and then giving that away. So, and just only seeing our stewardship of money as charity, but we enact sort of these limits in a way that gives opportunities for others who wouldn't have access to those opportunities. So that kind of that idea of gleaning, and then this question about, is there a line that we don't cross? How do we think about that? And is it appropriate in your mind, is it even possible as a business to leave some profits at the limit that, or limit what you pay yourself, or have other limits so that it gives opportunities for others who wouldn't have opportunities?
Yeah, that's a great question. It's hard for me to think of any sort of direct corollaries to the principle, to the practice of gleaning. Perhaps, unless you think about things like profit sharing with your employees as a benefit, or maybe 401k, matching things where you really are limiting the owner's return by those things that are that you're going to allocate to employees. So I guess there, in some senses, is a way of doing that, though it's limited to the employees rather than to the general populace. I tend to sort of go back to, perhaps the noblest work of capitalism, which is creating jobs, creating employment, people, things for people to do, work for people to do that is not, hopefully not only menial, that it does allow them to exercise their own gifts and talents, their creative ability. It allows them to understand the goodness of work, and they can provide for their families in that way. This is just, wonderful and historic trade-off between, labor and capital. I think in a sort of a perfect world, employers are not just considering the economic question of how much should I pay or do I pay to this employee or to this class of employees, but how am I helping them to become better people? How do I ask them, who are they becoming? Are they a better person at the end of their career as they work for your company than they were at the beginning? How has leadership development been encouraged in the business? So I think this question of employment just is so critical, in answering that question. While it's not directly gleaning, but it is allowing others, creating space for others to use their labor to create benefits for themselves and their families in a way that's ennobling.
Yeah.
That's a one view of it.
Yeah.
I love those thoughts. I think it's a difficult balance in business. When you're a for-profit business, it's a very difficult balance in that you have to be greedy. You have to be competitive and aggressive in order to create opportunities for people. If you're not a profitable business, then a profit sharing plan is not going to be very valuable. And so it's kind of it's a funny paradox in terms of how altruistic you are. Like you have to be an excellent business in order to have any any spoils to divvy up. And so on the business side of life, I really am zeroed in on wealth creation for the unwealthy. How does the unwealthy create wealth? Well, I know one of the hardest ways to create wealth is through current income. Current income is taxed, and then you've got to invest it, and then you pay taxes on your investment. And to me, the idea of divvying up the pie, divvying up the equity, is a much more efficient means of creating wealth among the unwealthy. And my thoughts are not fully formed, but I love the idea of broader based equity ownership in companies. And that, I mean, that's all the stock market is, right? The stock market is, a democratic means of anybody buying a slice of that company. If you want to rail about company XYZ making too much money, well, you got an opportunity to just buy them. Just buy them. If they make too much money, buy them, buy their stock. But I love the idea of that filtering down to private businesses as well. And um, our tax system rewards wealth creation through equity. It's a much more efficient way to create wealth, and if you are an equity holder, then you can be both. That moves you into the beneficiary side of the T chart of capitalism, from victim to beneficiary. It's much less important what wages the company pays at that point, right? Because if we make a higher profit margin because we've got lower wages, but I benefit because I'm an equity holder. So I'm either going to get my distributions, or depending on the type of company it is, if it's a, cash flow distribution kind of company, I'm going to get, my share of the pie. Or if it's a, low profit, high growth type of company, I'm going to get my cap gains, through an exit. And I think to some degree, I think we keep finding ourselves in this pattern of culture creating, solutions to problems that we should be leading on. And in the startup world, it's incredibly common for there to be broad-based equity ownership of a startup. And they use it as, a motivator and a way to get people on board and not be able to use their scarce resource of cash to pay W-2 compensation. But it's very common in the startup world that you have a very lengthy cap table. And it can be messy, but yet I think it's a really beautiful thing. And there's a lot of people, out in the Bay Area in California that have become very wealthy, not by starting a company, but just by being an employee in a company that was hot. And so how can we take that and, instead of enabling, privileged kids that went to the right school and could get a job at this company, how can we take that mentality, in more plain vanilla and boring businesses, but ones that, you didn't have to go to Stanford to get a job at. So I don't have a prescription there, but I just, that concept I dwell on a lot.
Yeah.
And I think there's something there.
So good. Well, I want to thank you guys. We're only just hitting the tip of the iceberg, and already we're at the end of our time. What I hope has come out of this conversation for those of you listening is, one, what we've talked about, which is how important it is to really wrestle with these ideas. Money can really get to us if we let it. But it's not bad in and of itself. It's how we use it. And also the thing that I think about as I'm listening to you guys, Craig and Hunt, is just the extra level of thought and leadership that's required to pursue these kinds of ideas in the course of running your businesses and your organizations. That if you have another set of lenses for how you want to have a deeper impact on the world through your work, you have to think very broadly about everything: how you pay your people, how you treat your customers, how you think about providing potential equity to the people who you hire. And it has a greater requirement on you as leaders. And therefore, it's that much more important for us to wrestle with these issues, not only ourselves, but together with others who want the same thing. So, and you guys have done that for me. So I really appreciate that. We might have to do another time together to go deeper in these topics. But I want to thank you for your time today and just your influence on me and your wisdom and how you're pursuing these ideas around money.
Thank you, David. It's good to be with you.
Thank you, David.